Hey, welcome to Just Cook with Michael. Today we're going to make a meatloaf. After watching this video, you will be able to make this really moist meatloaf dish for your entire family. So the ingredients for this recipe are ground beef. We also have ground pork, 2 eggs, some mushrooms that are going to be chopped up and put into the mixture, some onions that are going to be chopped up, sautéed, mixed in, some Italian herbs, ketchup, paprika, and for the glaze, we're going to have vinegar, brown sugar, and some more ketchup. A unique ingredient you don't always see in all the meatloaf recipes, but really adds to them to retaining moisture, is a little plain gelatin. So the gelatin will increase the capacity for the meatloaf to retain moisture. Basically, we're going to let it bloom, which means like dissolve a little bit in some warm ketchup, and then we'll mix it into the meatloaf. Also, the mushrooms. Not only do mushrooms add flavor to the dish, but mushrooms also impede cross-linking between the proteins in the meat. So the texture stays softer. In other words, when you cook meat, obviously it seizes up when it cooks. It denatures proteins. So about 140 degrees, proteins begin to denature. When the proteins denature, they'll get a little tougher. Imagine like an egg white when you expose it to heat. It goes from a liquid, it kind of binds up a little bit. Meat does that same thing. When you have a fresh hamburger, you could easily pull it apart, but when you cook it, those proteins denature, cross-link, and it makes your hamburger firmer. Well, by chopping up mushrooms really finely and sauteing them, it kind of impedes some of that cross-linking, so it stays really tender. Putting breadcrumbs in this recipe, in recipes, they retain moisture, and also they impede cross-linking of protein. Now I'm going to chop up the onions. This will be a pretty fine dice, maybe about 1/8 of an inch, and then I'll saute it. The only trick I know for not crying with onions is to work fast. Again, keep your fingertips behind the blade. Your knuckle is the guide. First thing we'll do after washing the mushrooms is chop them up finely. We want them really fine, again, to help prevent some of that cross-linking of proteins, keep the meatloaf tender, and also for good distribution throughout the meatloaf. Okay, I'm using olive oil to saute the mushrooms and onions. You could use any vegetable oil. Again, mushrooms have protein in them also, so they get that Maillard reaction that occurs around 280 degrees. And if you have too much water coming off your mushrooms in the beginning, you get a lot of steam. Steam water heats up around 212, so you're not going to get up to that 280. Therefore, you're not going to have that Maillard reaction. See, right now I'm at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. I won't add any salt until the mushrooms are done cooking, because again, salt will draw out moisture in the beginning, and we don't want that. We want to try to cook as dry as we can. All right, these have been cooking for about 5 minutes. They're looking good. Total time will be about 10 minutes over high heat. And again, that's what's nice about carbon steel pans, or not your basic Teflon pan usually. Still at about 350, which is above the temperature of 280 needed for that Maillard reaction. You can see there's very little steam. These are starting to brown. Now I will season with a little bit of salt. Again, usually I like to season as I go along. And a little bit of fresh black pepper. And these are done. I'll turn off my fire and I'll use the same pan to cook onions. Okay, the onions are looking great. It's been about 10 minutes on high heat. You can see there's definitely a lot of caramelization going on from the sugars in the onion. And again, sugars caramelize around 350 degrees, so that's why you need a hot pan. Now I'll add in a pinch of salt and some black pepper. I kind of like seasoning throughout the process, because at the very end, or when you have a big, bowl full of the pork, the beef, it's harder to judge how much salt you need. Usually as a whole, it's around 1% to 2%. But, I season as I go. And also at the end, like if you're not sure, make a little meatball of the mixture, throw it in the microwave and cook it and see how it tastes. If it needs more seasoning, add more seasoning. The next step is heating up the half cup of ketchup in order to bring it up to temperature so the gelatin could dissolve. So again, we could use our meat thermometer. Okay, I just checked the temperature of the ketchup. I'll sprinkle in my 2 teaspoons of unflavored gelatin. Probably should have, as I was pouring in that gelatin, been more careful and been stirring maybe with a little whisk or a fork to incorporate it right away into the sauce. So it just took a little more work, a little more time, but looks like it's all dissolved. And if your ketchup looks like it's thickening up, it's okay to put a few drops of water in there. I have my tablespoon of fresh garlic, the mushrooms, the caramelized onions, the paprika and breadcrumbs, my Italian herbs, the salt. Mix those together. Again, this little grinder is great because it has a little catch basin, so you can measure out how much you have. You can measure out what you're doing. All right. So it's just shy of a teaspoon, so I'll put a little more. Now we'll put in our eggs. Mix that together. Now we're going to put in our gelatin ketchup mixture. Okay, mix in that gelatin and ketchup. Now I will put in my beef and pork. Try to distribute these evenly. And now we'll just make sure everything is mixed up well. My oven is already preheating to 375 degrees. You want to combine this really well, but you don't need to overwork it. That looks really good. So the mixture is ready, I think. So what I'm going to do is, I'll get like a little meatball size here. Just put it in any little dish, and I'm going to microwave this for a few minutes just until it's cooked. Probably be overcooked a little bit, but anyway, the important part is I don't want to eat raw meat to taste if the seasoning's right, but I'll microwave it, let it cool down a little bit, taste it, and just to get a sense, is there enough salt? Is there enough pepper? Am I tasting the herbs, the garlic in there? This is where the art of cooking comes in. Don't be afraid to improvise and put some more Italian herbs, more paprika, whatever you think, but go. So my little meatball is done. Still fairly warm. And I really wouldn't be too concerned with things like texture at this point. We didn't microwave it. This is more just to get a sense, is there enough seasoning? And in my taste, it's perfect. So I'm not going to add any more salt, pepper, nothing. I'm going to line my loaf pan with a little parchment paper. It just makes it a little easier to jimmy out of the loaf pan once it's done. Not a necessary step, but I have parchment paper. You could use wax paper. Just it's a step I don't mind taking. Oven's hot, I'll put these in, and we'll bake them until they get to about 155. All right, one of the final steps in this dish is making the glaze to go on top of the meatloaf. A 3/4 cup of ketchup, just shy of a cup there. Brown sugar, 2 tablespoons, and vinegar, about 1.5 teaspoons. It could be any vinegar. I'm using white wine vinegar, but don't run to the store if you just have red wine vinegar or sherry vinegar or apple cider vinegar. Apple cider vinegar is a little more mild, so just probably add a little bit more. Even I think balsamic vinegar, not the really expensive stuff, but if you just have like an average balsamic sitting around, I think that would be really good in here. And we'll put this on the stovetop and just heat it up until it incorporates. The meatloaf is in the oven. It should take about an hour or so. I would say check it in 45 minutes in, and then probably about every 15 minutes after that. You want to pull it out around 155 to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. But a lot of it depends on the density of the pan you're cooking it in, and a lot of other factors, how cold the meat was when it entered the oven. So I would say about 45 minutes into it, use a really good meat thermometer like this one and check it. And then check it every, if you're close, check it every 10 minutes. It's important. You definitely don't want to overcook it. So you want to pull it out around 155, 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it'll cook about another 5 degrees. All right, our meatloaf is done cooking. I pulled it out at 155, let it rest for about 15 minutes. So you see, if the parchment paper, all you have to do is lift it, pops right out. You have a pretty clean pan, very easy to clean up. There you go. Now the meatloaf is ready to be cut up, to put the glaze over it and serve it. I'm going to serve it over some mashed potatoes. Then I'll just spoon that over the top. Absolutely delicious. So here's the completed dish. Now go out and cook for someone you love.